Okay, let's dive in. We've got quite a stack of material here today, and it seems to really orbit around the ideas in Robert D. Kaplan's book, The Tragic Mind.
That's right. But it's broader, too. It pulls in maps, literature, history, journalism.
Right. It's about how all these things connect to help us, understand the world. So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from your sources on this idea of the tragic mind.
Exactly. The aim is to explore what this material puts forward as, well, maybe the best way to think about navigating a world that feels pretty chaotic, full of tough choices, that constant threat of things going wrong.
And the argument seems to be that looking at things like fear and fate, the burden of power, doing that through the lens of, say, Greek tragedy and Shakespeare plus real history, that gives you a useful framework.
Yeah, a powerful one, they argue. It helps you gain crucial insight without just feeling overwhelmed by it all.
So we're not just reading history or philosophy here. We're trying to extract a way of thinking from all this material, a way to make sense of leadership decisions, the struggle for order, why things often, well, unravel.
Precisely. And at its core, this stuff explores a really central, sometimes frankly terrifying, tension. The absolute necessity of order versus the ever-present danger of anarchy.
Not exactly light reading then.
No, definitely not. But they argue understanding this tension is just vital.
Okay, so let's unpack that core concept first.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to cultivate this tragic mind?
Well, the way the material lays it out, it's about having this deep, almost gut-level awareness of human limits, acknowledging how much uncertainty is just baked into everything.
So not being overly optimistic.
Not blindly optimistic, no. It means looking ahead, sure, but also having a kind of productive fear. Not fear that freezes you, but fear that makes you watchful, scanning the horizon for trouble.
Okay.
It's knowing, really knowing, that actions often have unintended consequences, that things can go spectacularly wrong even with the best plans.
And why is this mindset seen as so important, especially for leaders making those huge calls about, say, war and peace?
Because, and this is the paradox, the argument is that thinking tragically is actually the best way to avoid real large-scale tragedy. They bring up Putin's invasion of Ukraine as an example, suggesting his actions show a leader who maybe lacks that tragic sense, maybe operating more from certainty or ideology than acknowledging the massive risks and potential for things to go sideways.
And they contrast that with how some recent policy elites might approach things.
Exactly. The view presented is that, well, if you're relatively insulated, physically safe, financially secure, maybe distant from the immediate consequences, it can be harder to really internalize this tragic view.
You might not feel the potential downsides as acutely.
Perhaps. You might lack that same visceral grasp of worst-case scenarios that the material insists is essential. They point to something like the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as a possible example, where maybe that kind of pessimistic foresight wasn't fully there.
Okay, so the tragic mind is about guarding against a fundamental danger. What is that danger, really, at its most basic level?
It's anarchy. Chaos. Yeah. That kind of Dionysian force that's always threatening to break through the surface of order.
Right.
The sources really hammer this home. They quote the medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, who apparently said, "1 year of anarchy is worse than 100 years of tyranny." That's a stark thought.
And it's not just philosophical quotes, right? They include firsthand accounts.
Oh, absolutely. Really vivid descriptions. Being in Iraq after Saddam fell, and they stress, look, his tyranny was awful, but the chaos that followed was terrifying in a completely different, maybe even worse way for many people on the ground.
Wow.
Or unsettling stories of, navigating roadblocks in Sierra Leone or the Ivory Coast run by ragged guys with guns demanding bribes. That sheer unpredictability, that fear when basic order just vanishes.
And that's different from the fear of tyranny.
It's presented as different, yes. Policy elites might easily grasp the fear of an oppressive state, but the primal fear of no state, of total chaos, that, they argue, hits differently if you've actually lived it.
So the counterpoint to that chaos is order, the Apollonian element, as they put it.
Yes, and the argument here is pretty strong. Order isn't just nice to have, it's the absolute bedrock, the first necessary step for civilization. The state's fundamental job, in this view, is to monopolize violence, to pull us back from endless cycles of revenge killing.
But they acknowledge the downside too, right? Order can become oppression.
Of course, yeah. That danger is fully recognized. Making order less tyrannical is the constant struggle. But the point they really stress is that just opposing tyranny, which feels good and morally clear, lets you sidestep the harder, scarier question. What if there were no order?
Mm.
Civilization in this telling is fragile, always threatened. Barbarism isn't just out there, it's in here, within us, always latent.
So how do we get our heads around this complexity, this push and pull between order and chaos, the tough choices? The sources propose a kind of combined approach.
They do. They start with the map, geography. It
Mm.
gives you the context, the constraints, the physical stage everything plays out on.
Like coastlines, mountains.
Exactly. Mountains dividing groups, soil quality affecting survival. That's the foundation, the basic structure you need to understand first.
But just looking at the map isn't enough.
No, they argue that's too deterministic, too fatalistic on its own. The understanding of why things happen, especially in world events, really culminates with literature, specifically Shakespeare,
Shakespeare. Why Shakespeare?
because he gets human nature. The passions, the irrationality, the instincts, the sheer unpredictable messiness of individuals interacting. So the deepest insight, they say, comes from layering these things. Start with geography, then drill down through culture, history, and finally right down to the individual human heart and his motivations.
So even huge historical shifts can turn on something really personal, a character flaw, a misjudgment.
Precisely. A single gesture, a stray remark revealing character. Even as those moments are shaped by and feed back into those larger structural forces. It's why, according to this material, you can't really have a hard science of international politics.
It's more about insight.
It's about insight, cultivated by looking at the world through this combined geographical and literary lens.
And the framework that ties all this together, geography, literature, history, individuals, is tragedy itself.
Yes, tragedy in that classical sense. It starts, they say, with that searing awareness of the narrow choices we face. And crucially, it's often not about good versus evil.
Right, you mentioned this earlier. It's about good versus good.
Often, yes. The triumph of one good thing over another good thing, and that conflict causes suffering.
The Iraq War example again.
Exactly. Removing Saddam presented as a good. But the sources argue it destroyed a possibly greater good. The existing, albeit brutal, order, the unintended result. Chaos, far more death. Tragedy, in this view, is about these morally defensible but fundamentally incompatible goals clashing.
This leans so heavily on the ancient Greeks. What are the key takeaways from those plays about things like fate and suffering?
Well, the Greek perspective, as presented here, is just saturated with fate, with necessity. Characters feel caught, almost puppets. They even quote Shakespeare's King Lear, "It is the stars govern our conditions," to capture that Greek feeling.
Oedipus being the classic example.
The ultimate example. His fate sealed before he was even born.
Yeah.
And the gods in these plays, they're not remote. They're right there, involved, pretty much. And humans, in this framework, can't really judge them. Defying the gods just leads to punishment, inevitably. But it's not just about being resigned to fate. The argument is this instills a crucial humility, an awareness of vast, unknowable forces, the kind of forces or facts on the ground that policymakers maybe sometimes miss.
So getting humbled by fate is almost part of the deal.
It's prevented that way. Humiliation is inevitable, even for the best, the most powerful, and suffering. Suffering is absolutely central.
The path to wisdom.
That's the idea. Echoing thinkers like Schopenhauer, suffering leads to knowledge, to that necessary worry. Wordsworth is mentioned too, actions fade, but suffering leaves a permanent mark.
Like Oedipus again.
Yeah, look at Oedipus. Starts out knowing so much, yet totally blind about himself. Suffers terribly, but through it gains wisdom. My sufferings have taught me to endure, he says. He finds dignity, purification, acceptance. His endurance, even in ruin, is what's honored.
And that battle of good against good plays out dramatically.
Oh, hugely. Think of the Oresteia, that whole cycle of curse and revenge. Agamemnon's choice, sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia for the state, for favorable wins. That raw conflict, loyalty to the state versus loyalty to family, to blood. It runs through the Oresteia and Antigone too. Hegel apparently saw Antigone as the ultimate tragedy of that specific conflict.
And Euripides' Iphigenia at Aulis, what's the focus there?
That one's highlighted for showing the sacrifice of innocence for the state's, well, cold machinations, as the sources put it. Euripides, in this reading, isn't saying the world can be fixed, but he makes you feel its brokenness, its pain, profoundly.
What about rebels, like Prometheus?
Right, Prometheus bound. Rebellion against unjust power, Zeus. And the sources draw an interesting contrast. The rebel can often afford to uphold pure ideals because they don't have the burden of actually governing.
Whereas the leader, the tyrant in some views.
The leader has that burden. They're forced to make those impossible choices between competing goods. Their hands get dirty. They're rarely beloved because...
I know. Okay, so moving from the Greeks to Shakespeare,
Yeah.
the sources highlight some key differences.
Yes, it's a definite shift. Shakespeare deals less with archetypes facing divine fate and more with individuals, complex people, mixtures of good and bad clashing with each other. And the big distinction they draw is, for Shakespeare, character is fate.
Meaning it's the person's own nature, their choices, that drive the outcome.
Exactly. Whereas for the Greeks, fate often feels more external, imposed by the gods or cosmic forces. With Shakespeare, it's more internal.
And ambition is a major theme, often destructive.
Hugely destructive, often. It's seen as necessary, sure, for progress, for striving, but it could also make you lose your bearings, forget who you are. And the struggle for power, especially when war is involved, is described bluntly as a blood sport.
High principles can hide other motives.
They often do, the sources suggest. They use the example of figures involved in the Iraq War decisions, like Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz. Stella resumes, yes, but the argument is that their character, their judgment at that specific critical moment after 9/11 was the decisive thing.
Shakespeare also explores that internal drama before taking action.
Absolutely. You get conscience, like in Hamlet, acting almost as an impediment to action, or the intense internal debate, the weighing of wrongs, like Brutus before assassinating Caesar. That's contrasted with Macbeth's relentless, almost feverish forward drive.
And the sources point out that toppling leaders, like Caesar, often backfires.
Yeah, the point made is that it rarely leads to the stability or improvement intended. More often, it opens the door to even greater chaos.
And there's one Shakespearean character singled out as the ultimate villain.
That's got to be Iago from Othello. He's presented as literature's peak representation of motiveless evil, pure manipulation, disinformation, deep cynicism. They even draw parallels between Iago's methods and modern figures, like Putin.
Wow. How does Iago connect back to that battle of good against good in real-world statecraft?
Well, he represents the challenge of confronting pure, destructive evil when you also have other massive responsibilities and constraints. It's easy, morally, to just declare I'm against evil.
Sure.
But real statesmanship, the argument goes, involves trying to square what is considered just with what is considered possible.
You need concrete examples there.
They give them. FDR allying with Stalin, a brutal dictator to defeat Hitler, an arguably greater immediate threat. Or Nixon and Kissinger making overtures to Mao's China, despite the horrors of the Cultural Revolution happening right then, because they needed to balance the power of the Soviet Union.
So the tough argument is that sometimes you have to accommodate some evil to achieve a greater good, like stability or avoiding a bigger war.
That's the difficult implication, yes. Maintaining a balance of power, preventing a catastrophic hot war. These might be higher moral goals that demand morally messy compromises. A rigid, self-righteous stance, however appealing, can sometimes be counterproductive in statecraft.
Okay, shifting gears from literature to life. The sources draw lessons directly from the experience of war itself.
Yes, and they are unflinching. They describe the reality beyond just the physical danger, the constant grinding fear, the awful physical discomfort, the filth. They quote Aeschylus's Agamemnon and use first-hand accounts from places like Fallujah to paint a picture of war as just absolute hell.
Any romantic notions are dismissed.
Completely. Idealizing violence, like Falstaff mocks, is called monstrous and naive.
And the burden on leaders after a failed war must be crushing.
Described as maybe the heaviest load. Knowing thousands died, and it achieved nothing, or even made things worse, the sources make a direct comparison between the ancient Athenian expedition to Sicily.
Thucydides wrote about that, right?
Exactly. A confident, ambitious push into a distant war that spiraled into total disaster. They compare that to the Vietnam War getting drawn into a faraway conflict, escalating, ending in catastrophe. Similar patterns, centuries apart.
There's another striking historical parallel they draw too, isn't there, between Xerxes and the Persians invading Greece and the more recent Iraq War under George W. Bush.
Yes, it's presented as almost mythic in its resonance. Both started with rapid, seemingly unstoppable advances. Both ended in sudden, humiliating failure. Both serve as stark warnings against hubris, overconfidence.
And in both cases, the home front expected an easy win.
Right, a holy task, almost. Only to see it unravel disastrously in a complex, hostile environment. There's this sense in both accounts, the sources say, of encountering something bigger, some power something not human, whose weight tipped the scales of luck.
That leads to that unsettling idea about fate.
That maybe fate isn't just something that happens to us from the outside. Maybe fate is something we do to ourselves through our own choices and flaws, and then we blame the gods or circumstance afterwards. Iraq, they suggest, has that kind of mythic quality in retrospect.
And the more recent failures, Afghanistan and Iraq, offer their own specific warnings.
Absolutely. A key takeaway highlighted is how structures we spent years and fortunes building, like the Afghan state and army, just evaporated, revealed as hollow, essentially fictional. These are presented as really sobering lessons for any future interventions.
So given all this risk and complexity, how should leaders operate? The sources talk about balance.
Yes, finding the right balance between courage and fear is presented as absolutely critical. Courage alone, especially mixed with ambition, is a recipe for disaster, but fear alone leads to paralysis, inaction.
Who got it right, in their view?
They really praise Eisenhower during the Cold War. He apparently resisted pressure, even from advisors, to use nuclear weapons. He chose a middle way, a strategy they say came from both a steely character and a deep constructive pessimism.
So he was governed by fear as well as courage.
A productive fear, yes. A realistic assessment of the catastrophic downsides, tempering the impulse to act boldly just for the sake of it.
How does all this apply now to the challenges we face today?
Well, the material points directly at the current era of great power competition, US, China, Russia, and the message is stark. The stakes now are infinitely higher than they were in Iraq or Afghanistan. A miscalculation today could be globally catastrophic.
They mentioned the specific danger of a hot war with China.
Explicitly. Over Taiwan, in the South China Sea. They sketch out the potential nightmare. Markets crashing, huge casualties, the sheer confusion, the fog of war at sea, in cyberspace, plus the difficulty of even knowing for sure what the other side's intentions are, especially with subtle moves.
And modern life adds new complications.
Definitely. Things like social media are flagged as inflaming divisions, weakening national cohesion, and distorting analysis because raw emotion can spread so fast and override careful thinking.
There's also a point made about America's changing role in the world.
Yes, they talk about the U.S. journey, maybe reluctantly, from republic to empire, and how that means, as the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr put it, losing ourselves a bit, constantly running up against other wills, other forces that don't bend to our desires. We're not fully in control.
They even mentioned Trump's election.
As maybe reflecting that, showing the system's fragility and how, in our connected world, pathologies from far away can suddenly manifest right here at home.
Okay, so it's a pretty grim picture often. But the sources do talk about finding wisdom, finding endurance, right?
Yes, absolutely. And often that wisdom comes the hard way through suffering, failure, even public shame. They suggest that failed policymakers like Nixon after Watergate, as described here, can actually become more interesting, more reflective because of their downfall.
Failure teaches humility.
Deeply. And endurance, they suggest, comes partly from recognizing our place in the grand scheme of things, submitting, in a way, to higher forces, whether you call them gods, nature, fate. Not passive resignation, but a humility that allows for gratitude, even amid life's cruelties. Acknowledging failure leads to deeper self-knowledge.
So tragedy isn't just about feeling down, it's supposed to elevate.
Exactly. It demands something more than just sad decadence. They draw in Nietzsche here. Grappling with tragedy, facing these hard truths, should actually send you back into the world with renewed energy, strange as that sounds.
And Dostoevsky is mentioned too.
Finding resurrection through love, even amidst suffering. It connects back to finding strength by accepting something larger than yourself, linking Greek ideas of fate with maybe Christian ideas of acceptance and endurance.
So, while some evils might be beyond tragedy's scope, this tragic thinking still has a vital function.
It cultivates that anxious foresight, that productive fear we talked about, which is seen as a prerequisite for trying to build a better world, mainly by warning us of trouble before it hits.
It means accepting you can't fix everything.
Precisely. Accepting that hard choices with painful outcomes are unavoidable. But life has to go on. And they argue, for those of us lucky enough not to have firsthand experience of war or mass death, the literary classics are actually better guides to this deep understanding than social science alone.
Well, this deep dive into your sources, it's been really eye-opening, seeing how this tragic sensibility drawn from the ancients and from hard experience offers this powerful, if difficult, way to look at our world.
It really does push for that humility, doesn't it? And critical thinking, finding that balance between being brave enough to act, but fearful enough to be cautious.
Leaves you with a lot to think about. Maybe the most powerful takeaway for me is that constant, maybe unresolvable tension. They describe the need for order, always wrestling with the threat of chaos just beneath.
Or perhaps that difficult idea that ambition is almost inescapable unless it's tempered by fear. That's a sobering thought for anyone in power.
Or that really haunting line you mentioned earlier, that fate is something we do to ourselves and afterward blame the gods, makes you look at events differently.
Definitely things to carry with you.
Indeed, as you look at the world around you. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.